Welcome to WorkIt, How to Transform Your Resume. We're going to discuss a couple things in this seminar. First, we're going to talk about what U.S. and international employers mean when they say resume or CV, because it can differ depending on the country. Next, we're going to talk about some general advice for all professional writing that you should keep in mind. And finally, we're going to break down piece by piece how to write a really good resume. Just to let you know about the Writing Center at the Worcester Campus Research Library, we offer one-on-one writing consultations in case you're struggling with a particular assignment or essay that you're trying to do. We have weekly write-ins at the library, which are sort of like focus groups for trying to beat that blank page. Think about it like going to the gym. If you have buddies that you're going with, you're more likely to actually show up and get the work done. And it's the same thing for writing. If you have a bunch of people that you're meeting up with and accomplishing small writing goals with, it's easier to break up things like theses and big papers so they don't feel as overwhelming. We also offer advice about resumes, cover letters, and CVs if you need assistance with those. And finally, we also have webinars like this one. We have a great one on cover letters that if you haven't seen it yet, you should definitely check it out. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to shoot me an email. My email is Crowner, that's Crowner, crowner.7 at osu.edu. So, when we talk about a resume, or a curriculum vitae, what exactly do we mean? It's actually different depending on the country. Internationally, resume and CV can mean the same thing. It depends on the country. Sometimes they mean different things. In the United States, a resume is typically 1 to 2 pages, and it shows work history and experience for industry positions. A federal resume is closer to a CV, and it includes an affirmation that the document is correct. A CV can be much longer, and it shows educational background, work experience, publications, and so on for academic positions or government jobs. There's also some differences in information. Internationally, it may require a personal statement. They may require an attestation that the things stated in your resume are true. They may require a photograph of you. And they may also ask for race, ethnicity, citizenship, and nationality information before they hire you. In the US, it's a little different. A personal statement can be very helpful, but it's not required. Only federal CVs require attestations. You really don't need to include a photograph unless you're an actor or a model. Since the US is such a diverse place, recruiters want to avoid unintentional bias when hiring people, and sometimes you can make assumptions based on someone's photograph about their capabilities to do the job, which really has no place in a hiring environment. They will ask you if you are eligible to work in this country and have a visa, and they may ask your ethnicity or disabled or veteran status, but they'll do this after they hire. It's not something that they're interested in before they hire you because, again, they don't want to be biased in their hiring. But once they've hired you, it's useful to know these things so that a company can examine whether or not they're hiring from a diverse population. A couple of tips for professional writing. These are useful for resumes and pretty much any other professional writing you're going to do. A few basic do's and don'ts. You do want to use fonts like Times New Roman, Arial, or Georgia that are easily read. This is not the place for Comic Sans, Papyrus, or another really cool font you found on the internet. People are trying to read this super quickly, so make it easy to read. Another thing that makes it easy to read is leaving a 1-inch margin around the page. You don't want to cram too much information on there. Your eyes will just glaze right over it. And bullet points can be great for drawing attention to specific points that you want to make, but don't bullet point everything. just do the important things. This is really critical. Read your writing out loud to yourself. I cannot emphasize how many mistakes this will catch. I have been doing writing, technical writing, editing, and other creative stuff for years. And I still have moments where I have to sit down, read something out loud, and I go, how did I miss that? It is really, really easy if you're just reading something to yourself quietly to have your brain skip over things and fill in things that aren't really there, and you think something is good when it's not. There's something about the act of reading things out loud that makes your brain go, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't sound natural. And even problems like grammar can be so much easier to catch. I really highly recommend it. I know it takes a little bit more time, but wow, it improves your writing so much. And finally, always change your job titles to reflect what you actually did at that position. Now, I'm not saying exaggerate your job titles. We'll get into that. That is not a good practice. But if you're working at a company, say as a fiscal associate 2, that may not really mean anything to someone outside the company. It may be more useful to go, I was the requisitions manager for finances. Okay, and then someone can look at that and see, based on your job responsibilities, yeah, okay, that makes sense. They worked with requisitions in the purchasing department. Cool. I understand what that is, and that seems like a good fit for the position we're hiring for. A couple of don'ts. Don't assume that the recruiter will print your resume in color. Some people really worry about whether or not the resume is visually appealing, and it should be, but they worry about it to the extent that they put a lot of graphics on there, or they put florals, or they do other themes, and that can just actually make it very hard to read. One of my favorite examples is there's a template in Microsoft Word, just a free template for resumes and cover letters, and it uses orange font on a blue background. Now, it is just a header, but if you print that off, that's going to be unreadable. There are a lot of things that look great on a computer screen, and they look terrible when you print them out in black and white. And you always want to assume people are going to print them out in black and white because color printing is expensive. You want to make sure also that you are not just listing your responsibilities at a job, you want to focus on the achievements. In other words, list the accomplishments that you have, not just the tasks. A task is, I made coffee. An accomplishment is, I increased customer satisfaction by 10%. You want to show what the outcomes of your job are, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Along the lines of what we were talking about before, you don't want to overinflate titles or job skills that you've had. Making it simpler for the recruiter to understand what you did at a job position and getting rid of confusing ultra-specific titles can be useful, but if you're stating that you were the CEO when you were the janitor, that's not going to fly. You don't want to overinflate your titles or responsibilities that you had. You also don't want to assume that Microsoft Word or whatever word processor you're using is always right. Word processors and spell checkers have gotten really, really good, but they don't catch everything. This relates back to reading aloud to yourself. This is where you'll catch a lot of the things that might look technically correct to the word processor, and they're just wrong. And you don't want to overshare or include too much personal info. Keep it professional. You do want to come across as someone that's enjoyable to work with, but you don't want to have so much personality that they don't really want to work with you. And finally, make it as painless as possible. Keep your resume and CV updated. Updating them regularly is really, really important because there is nothing worse than that feeling of, I need to look for a job, and now I need to go back and add the last 5 years of my work experience and all of my accomplishments, and I don't remember what I did 5 years ago. I don't know that I remember what I had for breakfast yesterday. I'm sure some of you can relate to this. So saving copies regularly and making additional copies of things that are tailored for specific positions is really, really useful. And just add things in every couple months so that it's not a big, arduous task that you have to sit down to. I usually have 1 or 2 versions of my resume where I tailor it to specific careers. If I'm interested in office work or HR work, that might be one resume. If I want to focus on library experience, that might be a different resume. And I can specify things that relate to that career, even though the work history and what I've done isn't really changing. I just focus on different things. If you use file names that are specific to what you're doing, you can find them more easily later. I usually include my name, what the position is, and then a year, month, day, either at the beginning of or the end of the file. The reason I organize it that way is because if you ever want to sort and find out what's the most recent thing that I did for an office resume, sorting it by year and then month and then day will actually pull up the correct dates. You'll get the most recent thing at the top. If you put it month, day, year, like a lot of us do in the US, it's not going to sort as well for you. It's a picky thing, but it makes your life easier. How do we build a great resume? Let's think about what good resumes do. They need to demonstrate the results of your qualifications and experience. They need to relate to the keywords that are used in a job posting. They need to be easily decipherable by busy people. And they need to be organized by importance and tailored to fit the needs of the job. So let's break this down point by point and see what that actually looks like. How are we going to demonstrate results? Why are results important? Because task lists just describe this job itself, not why you were great at it. Think about it this way. A hiring manager probably knows that you worked on research and ran tests if you worked in research. It doesn't add anything new to the conversation. If I'm a research assistant and I tell them I conducted tests, performed experiments, and used control variables, I'm not really telling them anything new. They know what a research assistant does. On the other hand, if we think about it in terms of accomplishments, a research assistant might look more like, I published research in Hort Science on colored light supplementation and how it affects growth speed in certain types of lettuce. Here we're not talking about tasks, we're talking about the results we achieved while working at this position. Entry-level jobs and resumes often focus on tasks. I need worker A to show up and do this thing from 9 to 5. Higher level jobs focus on results though. I need worker A to develop products that will increase our sales growth for the next fiscal year. If you're not applying to an entry-level position, don't write an entry-level resume. So what does this look like? How do we go from tasks to outcomes? Well, if you helped customers, maybe you could say that you increased your client base by 50%. If you ran field tests, maybe you improved the accuracy of those tests. If you wrote blog posts, did you boost site traffic? If you conducted research, have you published those results in a journal? And if you worked with databases, maybe you streamlined compliance tasks that those databases were involved with. There's a big reason why I have made this its own bullet point to think about, because keywording is basically how you get found by the algorithm that's sorting through the resume pile. How do jobs weed out applicants that don't fit their needs? Well, these days it's by software. So the software scans for relevant experience and keywords, or the system has additional questions that an applicant must pass first. This is where keywords are most critical. If you have anywhere from 50 to 200 applications, you're not going to go through them all by hand. So the software screens the resumes, and then a recruiter looks at the resumes that the application system passes on. This is where honesty is critical. Simply adding in a ton of keywords to fool or trick the screening software isn't going to pass a recruiter if those keywords don't actually apply to things that you've done. And then finally, different stages of interviews are held to narrow down the applications to final hiring decisions. So there are two ways to approach this. The first is to tailor your resume specifically to a particular job you want. You can take the job posting and find the keywords that they use, and then make sure that your resume includes them whenever you have relevant experience. For example, biochar is mentioned several times. Is there any experience or knowledge that we have that would be relevant to this job posting? If we don't know anything about biochar, we can relate to the field experiments mentioned that involve the biochar instead. It's still relevant, it's just less specific to the job. Some specific keywords here that we've highlighted involve biochar, soil greenhouse gas fluxes, collaborate with multiple universities, net zero emission cropping, soil properties research, crop agronomy, and statistical analysis. The other way that we can work on our keywording is to do a more general survey. Go through a couple of job sites and find 8 to 10 jobs that you're interested in and try to see what they have in common. If you want to work in an organic farm-to-table business, do these postings all ask for culinary experience? If you want to help design and develop new agrochemicals, should you have experience in weed management? And this isn't just great for helping tweak your resume. It can also show you where gaps in your resume might be. If you want a job that needs an MBA or 3 years of research experience, then you need to work on those areas so you can flesh out your resume. Why is it so critical to be able to read a resume quickly? This is something I've talked about in my cover letters seminar, and this is something that I've mentioned here. There's a really big reason why this is critical. They've done research on this. It's called the 8 seconds rule. The average recruiter spends less than 8 seconds looking at your resume. They did a study that tracked eye movement and discovered that recruiters really do not spend a lot of time looking at your resume. And this is also true of cover letters. They are skimming quickly through a document and they need to find the most relevant things quickly. So what does easy to read mean? It means that someone glancing quickly at your resume can immediately find what they're looking for without needing to decode it first. This is important to keep in mind when we're thinking about resumes, because visually appealing resumes can actually be harder to decode and interpret information quickly from, especially if your eye is drawn to an image first instead of text or headings. This is a slightly extreme example, but is this a successful resume? Several publications ran articles about this unusual resume and how it landed Joe Kelso interviews, but Kelso himself admitted that it didn't always end up getting him hired. When the economy started getting bad, he stopped getting interview offers at all using this resume. It's just a little too different, and your eye goes straight to the picture, not the qualifications. No matter how hard I try, I can't get my eyes off the screaming guy in the middle. to tell what he's actually done, and this is sort of a strange font and not really easy to read at a glance. Things like all caps and odd fonts, again, really hard to read. Being interesting may get you interviews, but it doesn't necessarily make you hireable. Remember, your goal isn't just to rack up interviews, it's to actually get a job. So that's an extreme example, but what about a more typical one? This is a template from Microsoft Word. Again, your eyes go right to the pictures and the colors on the page, not the qualifications or the accomplishments. It's a pretty resume, but it doesn't stand out in a good way if I'm hiring for a mid-level position. You want to make sure that a recruiter remembers you as the candidate with the great research experience and the impressive publications, not floral resume candidate. How creative is too creative? Let's think about it a different way. This is a painting by Andy Warhol. It's not the most creative, it's well done, and it's definitely art, but it's a Campbell's soup can. We can immediately tell what this is supposed to be. Now, I'm not knocking pop art. I actually like pop art, but it's not a landscape or a fantasy or a really different thing that we've never seen before. We can decode this in minutes. There's the brand, there's the logo, it's tomato soup. On the other hand, this is a painting by André Masson. And it's really creative, but we're not sure what we're looking at here. It's an abstract painting, and it might be meant to be completely abstract, or it might be depicting something, or there might be deeper meaning here, but I can't figure it out in just 8 seconds. Going through piles of resumes is exactly like this. Unless you're going into specific fields like graphic design or marketing, recruiters want to easily see at a glance what you offer. Is it tomato soup or chicken noodle? If I have 8 seconds to read a resume, or I'm colorblind, or I'm using a screen reader, how do I decode this resume? This is really interesting visually, but I can't tell if the person's qualified at a glance, so I might have to reject it. I don't have the time to pore over every nuance of the information the way the job seeker does. If you're going into marketing or design, more creative resumes are the norm, but you still want to make sure that the information is easily accessible. For example, if someone is colorblind, are they going to really be able to pick out all the color coding here? This is a better example, and the information is much more organized, but because there are so many columns and headings and color codes, you're still not really sure where to start. Your eyes kind of go all over the place. In 8 seconds, how much information have I really pulled off this page? Finally, if you're going into a more typical career, you want to think about getting rid of the clip art and just go for something simple and streamlined. The focus is you and not the pictures. This is a pretty boring looking resume, but it's not a bad resume. It's actually a very good resume. This resume was actually designed by a recruiter who worked for a pretty big national company for several years, and they liked this particular design not because it was splashy and colorful, but because you can get information out of this really, really quickly. When people scan a document, the first thing that their eyes look for is headings, and then they look for information organized under those headings. It's a kind of visual reading style that researchers call layer cake. Your eyes scan across the headings like layers in a cake. That is the best kind of reading, and the one that you want recruiters to look at your resume with. And that's why headings are useful. You can make sure that they're able to quickly find what they're looking for, instead of disorganization where their eyes start skipping down the page and they may be missing things that you wanted to highlight. And this relates to why you should keep it organized. If we think about someone only glancing at a screen or a piece of paper for 8 seconds, what do you want them to see first? Your strongest points. So if you're just starting out in your career and you have more education than work experience, list your education first and include things like your major, your GPA, and any activities or accomplishments that you're proud of. Otherwise, put your work history first, starting with your current job. Emphasize 1 to 2 big things that you've accomplished for each position that are relevant to the position you're applying for. What your eyes are drawn to first is the impression that you'll make. So instead of graphics and lots of color, you want to use a more traditional looking resume, particularly if you're going into a field like engineering or agronomy. Obviously, you want to include your name and contact info. Use a professional email like firstlast@gmail.com, not sweetgaminghacks@gmail.com, and leave off your address. You don't need your specific house and street address. A city and state is fine if you want to show that you're local, but you don't really need more. Having a complete address on a resume is a holdover from when everything was snail mail and it was on paper. Next, you can think about adding a personal statement. This is optional, and I've had great success with resumes that have not included a personal statement. Whether you do or not is up to you, but it's a great idea to at least think about considering one, because it's a brief sentence or two that can sort of summarize what your experience is and why you're great at the position that you're doing. Next, you want to include your work experience, and then any relevant education that you have, any skills, and interests that you have. So, why a personal statement instead of an objective statement? Well, an objective statement states what you want to achieve with your career. That's not a bad thing to be thinking about, but it's something that a company should be interested in generally after they hire you, not before. The fact is, people want 2 main things from their job. They want money for financial stability, and they want passion, so they're excited to go to work and not burnt out at the end of the day. If everyone wants those 2 things, particularly if you're starting out in your career, your objective statement is going to read like every other applicant's, which is why recruiters don't really bother reading an objective statement. Many recruiters and hiring managers have agreed that objective statements are just not really adding anything to a resume, and they're not necessary anymore. A personal statement is better. It's the new version of an objective statement. You can choose to leave it out, but a good personal statement can be helpful in standing out. It's a good way to quickly sum up your best accomplishments and experience for that 8-second glance, but you can also just choose to leave it off entirely unless the posting asks for it. Work experience should be organized so you can easily see multiple promotions or positions that you've held with the same company. You want to avoid breaking each position into its own main heading. This not only makes it harder to read, but it may also make it appear at first glance that you haven't stayed with any particular employer for more than a year or 2. Instead, use indents and bullets to give clear organization for a recruiter to quickly see the most important things you've done. If we think about that visual layer cake scanning that goes on with good headings and good bullet points, this is an ideal example here. You can quickly see that someone worked for Arcane Incorporated, and they had multiple roles and promotions. They worked there for 3 years, it was in Columbus, and they had 3 different roles while they were there. And hey, they moved from intern to assistant content creator to an actual content creator. So they clearly were doing a great job at what they were doing. And then if we need more granular information about what they did specifically, we can find that in the bullet points. Education should come next. If your GPA is under a 3.5, just leave this off. CNBC and many other news and job hunting sites have agreed on this one. You want to highlight your biggest and best accomplishments, and you don't want to emphasize any weak points that you might have. There's a new trend going around where people use graphics to rank their skill sets, but this isn't as useful as it seems. You might think that you're a 10 in Excel, but you might be a 4 in reality. A recruiter can't know this unless you include links to actual work for them to see, like a portfolio. Listing certifications and classes is more useful than self-rating your skills. Instead, think about bullet pointing or listing skills that are relevant to the job posting's keywords. You want to avoid things like proficient at Microsoft Word unless the job specifically asks, because most people will assume that you are already proficient at Word automatically. The idea is to highlight strengths while avoiding filler like good communication skills, people person, proficiency with computers, and so on. Don't waste space on your resume stating the obvious. And finally, if someone's read all the way down to your interests, it means that they want to know more about you. Include some career-related things and some fun, more personal things. Will they enjoy working with you? So, how can Worcester Campus Research Library help? Well, 77% of recruiters said that bad grammar and typos would disqualify an applicant immediately. There are plenty of things that can make a bad resume worse or a good resume great, but the most crucial thing that you can do is read it out loud to yourself. When you read something out loud, like we mentioned before, you can catch tons of writing mistakes that your eyes might skip over or autocorrect in your brain if you only read them. You don't want to rely on Microsoft Word to catch everything. Sometimes it's right and sometimes it's very wrong. If you need more help fixing your resume, your cover letter, or any other writing that you have, please feel free to reach out to me and set up a writing consultation. Finally, I wanted to cover a question that we had in both our cover letters and our resumes presentations from several people. What is a good template to use for resumes or for cover letters? The answer is it just depends on what position you are applying for. A resume for engineering is going to look obviously vastly different than a resume for graphic design. If you are applying for a graphic design position, I would suggest looking at some examples of what people have done, because those resumes are really focused more on being able to show off your skills, your ability, maybe your great package design and how you can package information together to make your resume visually interesting and more tactile in multiple parts. But if you're doing something more straightforward, like agricultural science or research or engineering, a simple template like the Popular Recruiter one, which I found on Reddit's jobs subreddit. It's one of the most popular posts of all time, and we actually have a link to that on our LiveGuides website, along with some other career advice and useful tips and things that I've found useful. So look at what is popular in your area. Do a Google search, look at some sites that offer resume templates. The important thing is to look at, are the headings clear? Is it bullet pointed? Is it well organized? And does your eye immediately go to the right information? I hope this was helpful for you, and if you have any questions for me, again, my email is Crowner, CROWNER, crowner.7@osu.edu, and if there's anything I can help you out with, please shoot me an email. I'm happy to help. Thanks for watching, and good luck with your job search.